Greetings. This series of lectures explore the topic of ekphrasis as it evolves from antiquity. In the first video, the definition of ekphrasis and its relation to aesthetics is presented. There is also an introduction that directs attention across different time periods until the Romantic period. The second video of the series concentrates on the analysis of Romantic explorations on ekphrasis, and it looks at 4 poems. The Romantic period experienced a sudden increase in the popularity of ekphrastic poetry. It coincides with the discovery of ancient artworks in various excavations in Europe, for example, the Herculaneum in 1738 or Pompeii in 1748. A concern for the preservation in museums and the records of history and poetry also occurs. Various museums were established at this time. For example, the British Museum, dating from 1759, the Louvre from 1793, and the National Gallery from 1824. The first exhibition halls and auction houses, like Sotheby's, opened in 1740 and Christie's in 1762. The expansion of engraving first and later the development of the daguerreotype and photography all drew artists to experiment with different modes of vision and forms of recreation across different art forms. Finally, the last video of the series moves from the Romantic period to contemporary electronic literature in order to see the progression on the discussion from ekphrasis to intermediality. Only recently, in the 20th century, has art been defined as an instrument that gives autonomy to sensorial experiences beyond perception, enabling the transformation of mere informative content into high-impact emotional reception. Aesthesis was described in ancient tradition as the process in which mental images of the contingent qualities of individual things are presented to the mind. For centuries, scholars coming from various disciplines, including philosophy, psychology, sociology, anthropology, as well as art critics and artists themselves, have tried to explain how this happens. The discipline at the core of such inquiries is aesthetics. Since the 1990s, digitalization has altered the conditions of the creation of art, which nowadays takes the form of intermedial products. The study of intermediality concerns media borders, that is, attention to how multimodal structures, text, image, audio, video, interact, and also how their particular distribution, for instance, on a comic strip in a graphic novel, or on the more complex intermedial environment of a computer screen, in a video game, for example, may provide a specific delimitation of space and time. The distribution of the sensible determines what is visible, and in the case of digital environments, the underlying software also determines how content might be shared, changing the conditions of reception to include more immersive experiences of perception and cognition. Implicit in media, there are cultural borders and social divisions that result from them. Indeed, the distribution of the sensible has a social impact. Media configurations are human interventions, and as such, they perform cultural actions. Therefore, the political and ideological significance of mediated forms of expression depends on the material aspects, possibly being also a matter of a dominant critical culture. For example, media configurations based on moving images and sound, such as television, cinema, and video, are designed to operate in a way which might be different and yet complementary to the role of music, as well as text-based forms such as narrative fiction, non-fiction, etc. When a narrative is transformed across different media products, the term used is transmedia. Intermediality explores the relations amid media borders. In the Western world, the first discussions on the affective responses to art objects, what we know as aesthetics, came mainly from the Greek philosophers such as Plato, who claimed that human behavior flows from three main sources: desire, emotion, and knowledge. In his dialogue, Timaeus, Plato explains how any process of creation replicates by means of analogies. And you have the quotation on your screen. By now, nobody explained their origin, but we call them elements of the universe. There is ground to compare them with some type of syllabus. First of all, he, and Plato refers here to the creator, he took away one part of the whole, and then he separated a second part which was double the first, and then he took away a third part which was half as much again as the second and 3 times as much as the first. And then he took a fourth part which was twice as much as the second, and a fifth which was 3 times the third, and a sixth part which was 8 times the first, and a seventh part which was 27 times the first. And after this, cutting off yet other portions from the mixture and placing them in the intervals. After Plato, who is writing around 400 to 300 before Common Era, Aristotle developed the parallel between poetry and painting and claimed that although the object of both arts was imitation of human nature in action, their means for achieving this were different. Poetry uses language, rhythm, and harmony, and painting uses color and form. Aristotle explained genre division with regards to the subject agent who performs the analogy or mimetic act. Thus, he inscribed art within analogy and representation, he called mimesis, and simultaneously within telling and narration, diegesis, a process easily visible in today's selfie technology. He also warned that to appreciate the beauty of a snowflake, it is necessary to stand out in the cold, reminding us that aesthetics requires experience from all human senses and perceptual modes. The term ekphrasis is derived from Greek ek, which means out and also full, and phrasein, which means to speak or tell. It literally means to speak out, to tell something in full. The Oxford Classical Dictionary defines it as an extended and detailed literary description of any object, real or imagined. Originally, it named a rhetorical exercise whereby something was rendered visible for the listener. Thus, ekphrasis has been used to describe the skills that enable the translation of artistic content and its expression in different formats, whether painting, sculpture, oral poetry, writing, dance, performance, and so on. Until the 20th century, ekphrasis was mainly contemplated as the verbalization of aesthetic aspects from visual media, mostly painting and sculpture. One of the first reflections on ekphrasis comes from Plato's dialogue, Phaedrus, where Socrates is saying, "You know, Phaedrus, there is the strange thing about writing, which makes it truly correspond to painting. The painter's products stand before us as though they were alive, but if you question them, they maintain a most majestic silence. It is the same with written words. They seem to talk to you as if they were intelligent, but if you ask them anything about what they say from a desire to be instructed, they go on telling you just the same thing forever." The Greek biographer from the 1st century Common Era, Lucius Mestius Plutarchus, indicates that a person called Simonides calls painting silent poetry and poetry painting that speaks. He mentions this in the Gloria Ateniensium, which you can find in the Perseus project. Plutarch refers to Simonides of Chia, a poet from the 500 before Common Era, who was one of the first to affirm that poetry is speaking, pictures and painting is silent poetry. Apparently, Simonides might have also been the source for the famous dictum by Roman poet Horace, writing in the 1st century before Common Era, in which he affirmed in his Ars Poetica, "Uct pictura poiesis," as is painting, so is poetry. Plato also mentions Simonides in the Protagoras, along with Greek poets Homer and Hesiod. Indeed, the Homeric description of the shield of Achilles in the Iliad is Western literature's earliest and most influential example of ekphrasis. Plato was also concerned that any form of representation found in writing or painting was an unreliable source of knowledge that gave only a simulation of reality. We must remember that for Plato, the real is the abstract world of ideas, linked to the divine and lying beyond human reach. According to Plato, the only way to reach the world of ideas was through the process of anamnesis, presented in his dialogue Phaedon, or of the soul, a sort of contemplation, inner memory, or insight. In the Sophist, Plato also maintains that the imitation is a sort of man-made dream produced for those who are awake. This is a quotation from Plato's Sophist. And in this dialogue, he also characterizes sophists as imitators, and imitation as only partially similar to the idea it represents. In chapter 1 of the Poetics, Aristotle distinguishes between different forms of imitation with reference to the medium used, such as words, gestures, shapes, colors, and so on. The external imitation object does not necessarily physically resemble the things it represents, but rather results in a mental image representing something individual that carries emotion overtones. He notes the following, and you can see the quote on your screen. Objects which in themselves we view with pain, we delight to contemplate when reproduced with minute fidelity, such as the forms of the most ignoble animals and dead bodies. Aristotle also writes in De Anima, a volume about the human psyche, that again, when we form an opinion that something is threatening or frightening, we're immediately affected by it. And the same is true of our opinion that inspires courage. But in imagination, we are like spectators looking at something dreadful or encouraging in a picture. The term used by Aristotle to describe the impact of intense description upon the mind of the recipient is hypotyposis, from hypotypum, to sketch, outline, or also to stamp upon some kind of form. Thus, through hypotyposis, the mind receives energeia, energy, action, act. The term comes also from in and ergon, work. The prevalence of the word was also reinforced by the spread of the Judeo-Christian tradition across Europe and the Mediterranean. This devaluation of painting in favor of the culture of the book, referring to the Bible, which serves as basis for Jewish, Christian, and Muslim religions, can be seen, for instance, in the absence of painting from institutionalized forms of knowledge as developed in the first European universities, which taught the seven liberal arts, which consisted on the tribune, grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, and the quadribune, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Painting and sculpture were considered manual rather than intellectual labor, and therefore they were classified as mechanical arts. In the Renaissance, several attempts were made by painters and sculptors to reclaim a place for the visual arts and their status as artists rather than artisans or imitators. For example, Leonardo da Vinci's Paragon, composed circa 1510, reversed Simonides' comparison by claiming that if painting is mute poetry, then poetry is blind painting. In this way, Da Vinci sought to emphasize the limitations of both arts when it comes to representing reality. The term paragon, from Greek meaning a model or pattern of special excellence or perfection, refers here to the competition between painting and sometimes sculpture and poetry. In this treatise, Da Vinci considers painting the noblest art, since among the different perceptual modes, vision, he claims, is superior to hearing, the main sense involved in poetry. Despite these efforts, until the 18th century, illustration, engraving, paintings, and so on had a secondary role and were frequently used to clarify or embellish the supremacy of the written word. The root of this superiority lies on the concept of imago Dei, the image of God, theological doctrine in Judaism, Christianity, Sufism, and Islam, which asserts that human beings are created in the image and likeness of God. Creation, in all these accounts, is based on the prominence of God's word. God creates by saying, you have the quote from Genesis, "Now the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. And God said, Let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness." In this text, the English word image translates the Hebrew word tselem. In the Old Testament, tselem is used to refer to the physical likeness of a person or thing, and almost uniformly these images are not sublime. The term translates as shadow, which points to its meaning as a resemblance or reflection of something greater. It also means a handmade duplicate, and sometimes a figurine, patterned after a maker, which is how the ancient Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, conceived God, the maker. The image of the human being is therefore a mere shadow of the divinity, the light created by the word of God. This is the basis for the belief on the superiority of discourse over visual forms of art. To this day, in church celebrations, after the priest reads the scriptures during the so-called liturgy, he says the acclamation Verbum Domini, the word of the Lord, and all respond Deo gratias, thanks be to God. In 1695, John Dryden translated L'Art de la Peinture by Charles Alphonse de Fresnel, and it included a commentary entitled Parallel of Poetry and Painting, establishing an analogy between the two arts, poetry and drawing, and their aesthetic properties. Dryden explains that each discipline is equally valid in its field, but that no comparisons can be established between them since they are different means of expression. He uses the quote taken from de Fresnoy. 'Tis the pencil thrown luckily full upon the horse's mouth to express the foam, which the painter with all his skill could not perform without it. These hits of words a true poet often finds, as I may say, without seeking, but he knows the value when he finds them. In a publication entitled Museum of Words from 1993 by James Heffernan, the author affirms that before Romanticism, the texts that refer to art highlight the ephemeral nature of artistic creation. And he says that after the Romantics, the idea that visual art could make such a moment transcend time becomes an article of Romantic faith. And I'm quoting from page 91 and 93. In the 18th and 19th centuries, with the onset of the new rhythmic patterns of industrialization, inquiries on the representational differences between the arts were directed towards the temporal rather than the spatial aspects of analogy. In an essay on criticism from 1711, and also in some of his letters to friends and artists, the British poet Alexander Pope considered both painting and poetry to be equals. In Epistle 1 of his moral essays, entitled Of the Knowledge and Characters of Men, Pope reflects on the dialogue between reason and fancy and constant unpredictability. What he describes is similar to the situation we're facing these days, for Pope had survived the Second Bubonic Plague in England in the early 1700s. I quote from his elegy epistle. On human actions reason thou you can, it may be reason, but it is not man. His principle of action once explored, that instant is his principle no more. Like following life through creatures you dissect, you lose it in the moment you detect. Yet more, the difference is as great between the optics seen as the object seen. All manners take a tincture from our own, of come this color through our passions shown. Or fancy beams, enlarges, multiplies, contracts, inverts, and gives 10,000 dyes. Nor will life stream from observation stay, it hurries all too fast to mark their way. The German writer Gotthold Ephraim Lessing opens his Laocoon, an essay on the limits of painting and poetry, from 1766, by observing the following, and I quote, "The first who compared painting with poetry, Simonides, was a man of fine feeling, for poetry and painting are two equitable and friendly neighbors." However, Lessing emphasized the ability of poetry to excite mental pictures in a temporal sequence, thus creating the illusion of reality, and he expressed his belief that the visual artist is more limited than the poet, as he can only capture one point of view in a particular instant in time. Painting functions within simultaneity as a static object, while poetry moves on the axis of succession, and it is thus better able to create an illusion of reality. Lessing argues that painting is synchronic visual phenomenon, one of a space that is immediately in its entirely understood and appreciated, while poetry, again in the widest sense, is a diachronic art of the ear, one that depends on time to unfold itself for the reader's appreciation. He expresses this in the following terms: the rule is this, that succession in time is the province of the poet, coexistence in space that of the artist. Lessing compares the sculpture of Laocoon and his sons to Virgil's description in the Aeneid, book 1. Laocoon here is described as having warned the Trojans about the wooden horse that they received as a gift, and explain that it's going to be a trap. No one believes him, and they try to destroy him with burning spears. And in the meantime, two huge serpents, sea serpents, emerge from the water and devour his children. Laocoon comes to their help, but he is also devoured among cries of anguish. Lessing emphasizes the fact that it is more difficult to appreciate suffering in the statue than in the poem. But above all, Lessing discusses the impossibility of both arts to be completely faithful to reality, since poetry lacks immediacy and sculpture cannot give enough descriptive detail nor voice sounds. Inspired by Lessing's work, Edmund Burke's philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful, which was published 1757, shows great concern for the affective dimension of the beautiful and the sublime, creating a sharp contrast between an experience of the beautiful and an experience of the sublime, and relating those to human passions. Accompanying this emphasis on passion, Burke insists that the beautiful is not at all an idea belonging to proportion. This rejection of proportion represents a clear repudiation of the standard classical and neoclassical ideas of beauty. Proportion is associated by Burke with the measure of relative quantity, which is a matter for reason. To Burke, sensible beauty cannot be understood in the light of reason alone, for it requires imagination. This is his main thesis. However, Burke's emphasis on sentiment does not amount to the celebration of some sort of holy, innate, natural feelings which exist independently of learning or civilized society or reason. They are not categorically different from reason, as for the Romantics. For Burke, aesthetic response is primarily non-rational in nature, but nevertheless something which can be cultivated and developed. An idea picked up also by Coleridge, as we shall see in the second video of this series of lectures. The cultivation of what Burke calls just prejudice and its role in good moral and political judgment would seem to parallel closely the role of this cultivation in aesthetic judgment. But his treatment of the sublime is the aspect most debated during the Romantic period. Burke identifies the sublime as ruled by a core passion, terror, while beauty is ruled by love. He thinks that terror and fear are the strongest emotions, but that under certain circumstances they might be delightful. He gives the example of some ferocious animals as sublime, an argument that generated great controversy and ridicule, and that William Blake the poet, picks up in his poem The Tiger under the famous line, "Fearful symmetry." And if you're more interested in Blake, you can also see the discussion on Northern Fry ideas on my lecture on myth criticism, part 3. The following is a quote from Burke's philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful. It's part 2, chapter 1. The passion caused by the great and sublime in nature, when those causes operate most powerfully, is astonishment. And astonishment is that state of the soul in which all its motions are suspended with some degree of horror. In this case, the mind is so entirely filled with its object that it cannot entertain any other, nor by consequence reason or that object which employs it. Hence arises the great power of the sublime, that far from being produced by them, it anticipates our reasonings and hurries us on by an irresistible force. Astonishment, as I have said, is the effect of the sublime in its highest degree. The inferior effects are admiration, reverence, and respect. An important part of Burke's treatment of the sublime is his extended discussion on obscurity. Burke maintains that to make something terrible in a way which is sublime requires obscurity. Obscurity seems in general to be necessary, he specifically says. He claims that this is so because of our fear of the unknown. Burke attributes great power to poetry, which is, in his view, usually more effective than simple prose or a clear visual image in invoking an emotional response. He also connects his argument to the notion of vastness and infinity as sources of the sublime, precisely because they cannot be fully apprehended. Burke's sublime can therefore be tied to an experience of mystery, also in its religious connotations. The Canadian critic Northern Fry, writing in the 20th century in his monumental study on William Blake, also enhanced the connection between aesthetics and its spiritual and ethical underpinnings in an attempt to unveil the complex role of the occult and hermetic forms of knowledge in social change, an issue that has remained controversial and inevitably situated beyond rational scientific academic research because of its ties, for example, with esotericism and Freemasonry. The following is a quote from Fry. Now, when something is revealed to us, we see it, and the response to this revelation is not faith in the unseen or hope in divine promises, but vision, seen face to face after we have been seen through a glass darkly. Vision is the end of religion, and the destruction of the physical universe is the clearing of our own eyesight. Art, because it affords a systematic training in this kind of vision, is the medium through which religion is revealed. Finally, to finish with Burke, we must add that for him, the sublime is a particular response to the world, characterized by admiration and a sense of humility, because sublime is something much bigger than man. So therefore, man is humble. This connects his aesthetic interests in the sublime with his conservative political ideas. For example, in a previous work on the French Revolution, Burke had criticized the cruelty of the executions being carried in Paris. And these executions could have been deemed to present the terrible and therefore the sublime. But according to Burke, the explicitness of the acts did away with the mystery, so they could not be seen as forms of the sublime. In politics, Burke criticized the declarations of freedom and independence under the impulse of Thomas Paine, author of Common Sense, which was a pamphlet which influenced greatly the American independence. And therefore, Burke entered into great controversy with William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, who were both friends of Thomas Paine, and wrote several manifests and several essays against Burke. The influence of non-Western cultures was not felt in European art until after the expansion of colonialism in the 18th century. In Chinese and Indian art, for example, iconicity had always played an important role. Pattern poems were common in China, where pictograms, ideograms, and phonograms were incorporated into poems as part of their writing system. Shapes are also important in many Japanese haikus, and there could have been crossings between East and West, encouraged by the religious missionaries, for example, the Jesuits, even before the 18th century. And some of these are visible in the Greek visual poems, the Carmen Figuratum, and other examples that you have there on your screen. One of the earlier Chinese texts to deal with aesthetics was the Tao Te Ching, or Book of Changes. The Tao Te Ching is attributed to philosopher Lao Tse from around the 4th century before Common Era, and affirms the following thing about beauty. You can see it on your screen, the quotation. Beauty is Jing's confrontation with Yang. It's what dry grass calls the first sprinkles of rain. It's the first warm breeze of spring that touches the bat's wings, awakening it from deep hibernation. It's the sound of a mating call, the protection of a home, the feeling of friendship, the cheers of accomplishment, the welcoming smile of a stranger. It is the satisfaction of every profound yearning that disturbs each and every creature, every microbe, every cell, every molecule, every single atom and particle. It disturbs us because it is the very movement of Qi and the very substance that quickens the entire universe, bringing life to everything. This, I believe, is beauty. The Parnassian movement in France in the late 19th century was much inspired in Asian, both Japanese and Chinese, visual art, as well as in Greek mythology, and it included poems by Théodore de Vanville, Stéphane Mallarmé, Paul Verlaine, under the influence of Théophile Gautier and Charles Baudelaire. Many other artists have acknowledged the inspiration of visual compositions of various kinds upon their works. Just to give a few examples, we have Etta Hoffmann, Victor Hugo, Edgar Allan Poe, Honore de Balzac, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Emilia Pardo Bazin, Rudyard Kipling, Oscar Wilde, Anton Chekhov, Gabriel D'Annunzio, Guy de Maupassant, Rainier Maria Rilke, Pio Baroja, Edith Wharton, Günter Grass, Leonora Carrington, José Saramago, among many others. On your screen, well-known examples of graphic poems. George Herbert's The Altar, Dylan Thomas' Vision and Prayer, Lewis Carroll, Long and Sad Tale of the Mouse, Edwin Morgan's Siesta of a Hungarian Snake, and Apollinaire's Il pleut. In the 20th century, the best-known reference regarding the relationship between aesthetics and ekphrasis comes from Austrian comparatist Leo Spitzer, rephrasing the French poet Théophile Gautier, founder of the Parnassianist movement, who had also reflected on the topic in relation to a painting from 1664 by Claude Lorrain, known as The Enchanted Castle, which depicts a landscape with Psyche outside the palace of Cupid. Spitzer's commentary is part of his critical study on Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn as an ekphrastic poem. He defines ekphrasis as follows, and you have the quote on your screen. The poetic description of a pictorial or a sculptural work of art, which description implies, in the words of Théophile Gautier, une transposition d'art, the reproduction through the medium of words of sensuously perceptible objects d'art, ut pictura poiesis. This is the end of our lecture, and if you're interested on this topic, you can read the volume that I edited with Professor Ananta Sukla from University of Kolkata, entitled The Ekphrastic Turn, Inter-Art Dialogues. This was published in 2015. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you join me in the second video of this series on ekphrasis and intermediality.